your breath. Try to scare yourself to death. Bury your bones under the dirt and tear at your heart and rip your shirt and stomp your feet in disgust. Curse the gray skies if you must, but you'll find when you are done, blue skies for everyone.
How are you, Hugh?
I'm very good. How are you?
Good. Good to see you.
Good to see you. And you go by Val, don't you?
Val, yes.
Val, okay. Yes. And so Val is the founder and executive director of a nonprofit formerly known as It's My Death, um, that was founded in Maine in 2014, correct?
That's correct.
And now it's changed and serving in the state as Maine Death with Dignity. And so you joined Death with Dignity Nashville Center in September 2019. You serve
Yes.
as a statewide campaigns director, and where you coordinate focused campaign efforts in other states trying to pass legislation.
Yes.
And you also oversee grassroots support programs. You're also the mother of 3 children, 3 adult children.
Yeah.
You're an accomplished artist.
Yes.
Yes. All right. Welcome. Everybody has a story. I'm very curious, setting the stage of what your personal story is.
Sure. So my personal story is around the death of my sister, who died in 2009, just before just after her 49th birthday. She essentially went from diagnosis to death in about 3.5 weeks. It was all very unexpected. And through that process, what I learned is, first of all, how alone she felt, because the people around her were terrified to talk to her about dying. She was 49 years old. She was going to beat this thing, beat the odds. She was going to fight through it, and nobody wanted to talk about what would it be like not to be able to do that. To bring your life to a close at the age of 49, when that was clearly not in her plans. And so that experience really got me very interested in sort of breaking the taboo around talking about dying, simply because I saw how people couldn't be present with her because of their own fears around her losing her life. And the other thing that, I get asked this often, because people sort of assume that she had a bad death, and that's why I'm interested in the Death with Dignity movement. And in fact, the opposite is true. If death can be described as good, a good death, she had a good death. It was very quick and painless. She was not on hospital. There just wasn't time for anything. She just went very quickly. And what I don't have around that are traumatic memories of the way she died. She was awake and aware and responsive to me up to her very last breath, um, which is amazing. And so while I went through the grieving process and the trauma of losing my best friend in my sister, what I don't have as a residual is disturbing memories around how much she suffered. And I think that's what really compels me with the movement for medical aid in dying and Death with Dignity, is that patients and their families don't have that. They don't have the trauma related to difficult dying.
Can you talk a little bit more, so start off with what the movement is about and what the movement is not about?
That's a pretty large parameter, actually. So Death with Dignity National Center, our focus is on passing legislation that's modeled on the original Oregon law, which went into effect finally in 1997. And that is essentially a terminally ill patient with approximate six month prognosis, which is really that same medical system marker for when a patient would be eligible for hospice or should be thinking about that potential. Someone who is capable of making their own healthcare decisions and can be in the driver's seat through the process of qualifying for life-ending medication and ultimately choose when or whether to use that medication. On a broader scale, of course, across the globe, there are people who are interested in being able to maintain agency over themselves, even if they get dementia or if they have, really chronic, debilitating diseases that frankly have made life exhausting for them, even though they don't have the terminal diagnosis. And so the movement for, I guess, self-determination is really broad when it comes to end of life.
Yes. Yeah. Um, you know, your experience, what have you seen with regard to other people and what other people are advocating for?
Well, as a former hospice volunteer myself, I can tell you that I've witnessed some ways that people die that frankly I wish I could unwitness. I recall vividly sitting with an ALS patient who 2 weeks prior to her death, um, her joy in life was to be able to tell jokes and enjoy humor. And by the time she was within 2 weeks of dying, she couldn't breathe well enough to laugh anymore. And for her, I mean, that defined her quality of life. And I asked her, if there was anything I could do to make her feel more comfortable. And in between trying to get breath, she joked, she tried to joke that I could put her pillow over her face for her because it was just so agonizing for her at the end of her life. And of course we, laughed about it, and I didn't do that. Um, but for me, it really highlighted, like, who knows better what you need when you're dying than you, right? And I don't understand necessarily why that is such a difficult leap. That if I have agency over my life, my entire life, and I make critical decisions for myself my entire life without any intervention, why is it so difficult that I should be able to make those decisions at the very end of my life as well?
Yeah, I hear you. This is something that's been on my mind for quite some time. I'll briefly tell you my story and why this
Yeah,
is.
I'd like to understand what brings you to this question.
Well, I mean, this whole podcast is about how, reaching across the and how people relate to suffering, right? And how we work with suffering.
Right.
So this was important, always important to me. 1987, July 10th, 1987, my mother died. And she had a year-long brain tumor where she gradually, I saw her gradually, break down.
Right.
From month to month. And so when she was first diagnosed, I really didn't really have the wherewithal to really understand what this means and where she was going to go from here. But she died at home. We took care of her at home. And so I saw, I was in high school at the time. So I saw every single day, and I had to, take care of her, wash her, treat her bed sores. And so I saw that loss,
Right.
And that debilitation every day. And I also saw, the moment where she was still conscious, and she was scared, and she felt like she was trapped in a body.
Mm-hmm.
And she didn't really have the kinds of choices, the autonomy that she wanted.
Right.
And when she died, it was very painful to witness. The whole experience was very painful and unnecessary. And I told myself at that point, I want to make my own decision.
Mm-hmm.
I want to have that choice. If I'm allowed to have that choice, I want to exercise that choice.
Right.
And it seems to me that there's a no-brainer here. When we exercise autonomy, agency over critical decisions over um, our entire lives. We're allowed to do that, right? But we're not allowed to exercise choice in regard to our own death.
Right.
And death is something that's so universal that everybody can relate to a story. Everybody's witnessed death at some point, and death is never, well, it's hardly ever pretty.
Right.
But when you're talking about something that is um, where there's so many stories of people who can create their own context of how they die, it's just a beautiful thing.
Yes.
I guess this really, leads me to my next question with you is, so me and you were on the same page, but there is a definite pushback,
Yes.
definite opposition. What is that all about?
My feeling is that opposition is about moral questions or religious ideals around whether humans should be able to intervene when it comes to our dying.
Mhm.
Um, I mean, that's the opposition primarily that we see in this movement. It may look different, depending on who's speaking or who is opposing a bill. But it is about whether we should have agency over our dying.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um,
Well, I was reading some of the opposition arguments, and many of the opposition arguments related to legal matters. But all these kind of oppositional arguments seem to kind of break down when you talk about the realities of death with dignity. Tell me more about that. Kind of any issues or the realities of what we see.
well, it is true that when you really take the law and break it down into the step-by-step process that a patient goes through in order to qualify, all the opposition arguments break down. They just, first of all, in the past 25, since 1997, the history in this country is opposition can't point to a single court case. They can't point to an arrest record. They can't point to a situation where the law failed to safeguard a patient, their family, or their physician. And that's because it hasn't. The law in its structure is very simple. It basically says this is the process, this is the medical standard of care that patients and physicians will follow in order to qualify a patient to take the medication on their own. And when that death occurs under those circumstances, it's not subject to these other criminal laws. So it's not a murder, it's not a suicide, it's not an assisted suicide, it's not a physician abandoning his or her patient. It is a medically authorized and expected death under the law.
Mhm.
So, I mean, we could argue and discuss philosophically what is right or what is wrong about humans wanting to have control over their death. We could do that until the cows come home, and
Mhm.
we may never resolve that question. But medically and legally within the current system in the United States, it has been resolved
Right.
through these the use of these laws, and the laws are are completely optional. So healthcare providers, if they are morally opposed to this type of a decision, they don't have to support a patient's decision. A patient doesn't have to take their medication. The patient is the only one who can request to qualify and to receive that medication. No one can do that on a patient's behalf. So the arguments about, wanting to off granny for the inheritance,
Right.
um, I mean, that's a reality in our society today anyway, but the law doesn't make anybody more vulnerable to
Yeah.
that.
It's not a reality within death with dignity.
It
It's
is
not.
not.
Yeah. Yeah. And so so it seems to me all the legal arguments would break down pretty quickly.
They do.
That's it still remains a huge pushback, and I imagine um, each state has to really deal with their own uh, legalities of that. But so what do you think are the existential reasons, the kind of the root cause of why people have such a strong reaction to this?
It's I mean that's probably as varied as the number of people on the planet. So this how we die is nothing new, and our concerns around the way we die is nothing new. I mean, the first, as far as I'm aware, the first legislative effort in the United States occurred in 1906 in Ohio. The bill didn't pass, but and I think from the since humans have been dying, there have been questions around how to make that process less painful, less of a struggle. Um, and frankly, I don't. I think one of the things that has happened is we have so far removed ourselves from the reality of what dying looks like and caring for our loved ones in our homes, and we put that in the hands of medicine and behind closed curtains that frankly most of us probably don't know how to help someone die anymore, or to be present to that. Again, I think the controversy over it boils down to the moral question of whether we should have agency over that. It's that simple and that complex.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
I was just going to say, sorry, I think it's a mistake to talk about this issue at a, say, 30,000 foot view, because we can talk about what's right or wrong or what should or shouldn't happen all day long. But if we bring that down to the personal level, which really it is a personal question, I mean, what dying is more intimate to your life than having sex and having children, and it is the most intimate thing you will ever experience in your lifetime.
Right.
You'll be wholly dependent on other people, unable to help yourself, and you're leaving here alone. I don't know what's more vulnerable than that.
Yeah.
And yet you're told you can't be a part of that process. You just have to surrender to the fact that your body's dying, and best of luck to you.
You have
It
no
makes
control.
it makes zero sense.
Right. Right. You know, yeah. Yet this remains very, very controversial. So September, I think it was September 19th or sometime in September 2019, when the law was finally passed in Maine.
Yes.
And you had you really had a huge hand in having that law passed, correct? But yet that law passed so narrowly. I mean, it was only by what, 1 or 2 votes, correct?
It was passed by one House vote. Yes.
Yes, right, right. What do you think was the major turn for that? The success.
I think, well, so Maine has been trying to off and on since 1995 to pass aid in dying legislation, and I think there are so many things that come into play in a political system in order for a bill to turn into a law. So obviously you have to have the support for it. Your political climate in the state has to be appropriate for it. The political structure within your House and Senate and your administration has to be just right. So I got involved in this probably back in 2013 initially with the legislative aspect of this. And we had some successes up through up until 2019, but not enough really to get the bill passed. We had a governor who publicly announced he would veto it if it came to his desk. That holds sway over your legislature and what they're willing to do or not do. And so it wasn't until we ended up with a new administration that it even became possible for the bill to pass.
Right.
Well, I think it's like in any social movement, when a new idea is introduced, I think our psychology is like, whoa, wait, this is new. We don't know anything about this, so let's take steps back and figure this thing out. I think in our country we're really fortunate that Oregon pioneered this back in the 90s, and when they did that, they determined to gather information about who was using the law and why they were using it and what diseases they had, so that over a period of time we could sort of gather information about how it was working. And so for a long time, Oregon became like the state everybody watched to see if it was really going to work.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then in 2008, Washington came along. They also did data collection, so by the time you fast forward to Maine, we have had almost cumulatively probably 45 years of information available to inform us on how it was working.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
And
No,
I think that's what changes the tide, is the the consistency, the facts, and the fact that opposition is saying the same thing today that they said 25 years ago. Nothing's
yeah.
changed for
Yeah.
them either,
Argument has
right?
changed. And their argument has just kind of broken down over time, and the evidence indicates otherwise.
Exactly. And not only that, we've learned things that we didn't expect to learn. So the evidence also suggests that when the law passed in Oregon, it acted as a catalyst to help people begin to have conversations about the
Yeah.
end of their lives. It helped physicians talk to patients about the end of their lives and what to expect and what kind of services would be available, to the point now where Oregon's hospice and palliative care delivery is one of the top in the nation,
Right.
which is pretty amazing,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, it is pretty amazing. The whole movement is pretty amazing. And when you're talking about the larger conversation, there are some key people who have been part of the conversation for a while, and that have single-handedly really kind of turned the tide. One person I can think of really is, she's pretty famous, Brittany Menard.
Right.
January 2014, when she was diagnosed with a glioblastoma. And she was a strong advocate for death with dignity, aid in medical dying. And can you talk a little bit more about the individuals in the movement?
Sure. So Brittany, I think she continues to be a catalyst in this movement. What I think really she was able to bring to the forefront is, number one, she was a 29-year-old young woman who had just had her honeymoon and then found out she had a glioblastoma.
Yeah.
So, for the first time now, we have to contemplate, oh, you can die really young as a really young, healthy person, and something goes wrong in your brain, that's a death sentence.
Nice.
She chose to move from California, which had just failed a legislative attempt to pass the law, with her husband and mother to Oregon to avail herself of the law. And she also chose to make her story public.
Mm-hmm.
And that, I think, was a huge catalyst in the movement. If you look, there's a approximately 6-minute video on YouTube about her story. It probably has over 12 million views worldwide.
Oh, yeah.
And so that those personal stories really fuel the movement. Like, yet again, here's evidence that we don't always die well, and it doesn't always. It's not always the comfortable scenario that it can be portrayed as a good death, and that there is something we can do as individuals to save ourselves, I guess, from that kind of suffering.
Right, and it's not always. We have to keep in mind, it's not individuals who are saying, "Oh, well, just what, I'm not going to try to live, just throw in the towel."
Right.
I mean, Brittany Menard actually went through aggressive treatment, and then she was found a stage 4 glioblastoma, where it just overtook her brain, and then she asked questions: what does that look like what does the end of my life look like? And I wish my mom had that same opportunity back in 1987. What did the end of my life look like? Because it's horrible, not only for her, but for everyone involved. And you're talking about the medical costs, and you have to have the time away. My dad had to take lengthy extended time away from work, but he was able to do that, so we're kind of lucky. But it affected everyone in the family.
Right.
So are there other people besides I mean, I know there are other Brittany people besides Brittany that really stand out, but what other people in your neck of the woods really stand out to you that really turn the tide of the movement?
Um, I think any figure. So here in Maine, we just recently there have been two patient stories that were published of Ron DePrez. I don't know if you heard his story. His daughter is a journalist, and she wrote an amazing reflection on his accessing the law and what it meant to him as an ALS patient, and the meaning that it brought to her and her brother and to her dad as he died. And then Eric Carlson, that was another story that was published here in Maine, who he also had a brain tumor. And began to recognize as the brain tumor affected him, he began to recognize where his line in the sand was. Like when I think he said something like, when I can't stand in front of a menu at McDonald's and make a decision about the ice cream sundae that I want, I know my days are limited.
Yeah.
And I think, it truly, it doesn't have to be someone famous. It doesn't have to be, it's these personal stories that are relatable. As you mentioned earlier, we all have some story in our family. If we've lived long enough on the planet, we're going to witness dying. There's no evidence that anybody gets out of that.
Yeah.
And I can't tell you the number of horror stories I have heard since I've been in this movement of how people have died badly and how traumatized their family members have been by that. And I think that also fuels the movement. When you watch your loved ones suffer immeasurably before they finally take their last breath, and that's what you carry with you for the rest of your life as part of your grieving process. That is as compelling as a story like Brittany Menard's, where certainly her family is left with loss and grief, but they're not left with the trauma.
Yeah. Right. Now, I had read recently that approximately between 68 and 72%, there's a Gallup poll of Americans support the Death with Dignity movement.
Yes.
Called by many different names, but basically it's the same thing. If everyone had a choice, everyone was given that opportunity, what percent would you say would exercise that choice?
Well, I think, looking at Oregon's data is probably the easiest way to determine that. And if you look at the number of patients who have died in Oregon using the law versus the number of patients who die, or people who die per year in the state of Oregon, it's less than 0.5%. So it's a really small number of folks who want to avail themselves of the law. And it typically tends to revolve around cancer and neurological, like ALS type diseases, because those are pretty rugged processes when you start going through the paces of losing your body to those diseases.
Yeah. You talk more about what a patient is and family is personally going through when they receive a diagnosis, and they maybe are asking questions about this type of end of life care. What are they really going through?
Well, gosh, I can tell you what I went through with my sister. First is I have a friend who he helps people after death with home funerals, body preparation, and he says he believes that the funeral starts with the diagnosis, and I think I have to agree with him. Like, we merrily go along in our lives completely, mostly unaware of the fact that we're going to die. I mean, we pass our anniversary date of our death every year completely unaware that we've done that. If you and I were gallons of milk, we'd have an expiration date right on our forehead, right? But it's not that simple for adults. And then suddenly you have this devastating diagnosis. So it's like, slam on the brakes. Life is not going to go forward in the way that you imagined it might.
Mhm.
And so that I really think that begins the grieving process, and it really except in rare occasions, that's really the first time that people stop and think about, oh Lord, what is it going to be like to die? Because generally, I don't think that's built into us to do it very often, because I think it would make most of us crazy. Um, so there's wow, it's like, I would say it's like a meteor landing in your living room. That now suddenly all of the dynamics in the family change, the focus of the family changes, the goals of the family change. um and depending on the family and the people and the individual who's sick, and how willing they are to ask the hard questions or face the hard truth, and be willing to sort of break their hearts open to the fact that mortality is a reality, and we don't get to go on. I think there's just so many things that can completely shatter a family apart, depending on what happens post diagnosis. It's just it's challenging to navigate.
Yeah. Do you find that some people who are diagnosed are asking a lot of questions and want that right to die, but then family opposes, and so there's now a battle?
That it could be. I think with my sister, so her first initial feeling was she wanted to sue her doctor. So she had been under the care of a physician. She had not been feeling well. She had gone in several times to see if they could find out what was going on, and it was just missed. And suddenly, then she has a stage 4 lung cancer diagnosis with metastases in her spine and on her adrenal glands. And the first appointment she had with an oncologist, he told her, "I don't know how you're still on 2 feet with
Yeah.
this advanced cancer." Um, so her mind and her, she was not thinking about what is it going to be like to die. She was thinking about, I'm going to sue this guy, and I'm going to focus on treatment, and then I'll get through this.
Mhm.
Um, when I had an opportunity to go and be with her the last 3 weeks of her life, and I will never forget this conversation. I She was telling me about another attorney she had spoken to, and by the way, you can't. I don't know that there's a state in the country where you can sue a physician for misdiagnosing cancer, because it's so hard to find it in the first place.
Mhm.
Anyway, she was telling me what she had gone through so far, and I just asked her. I said, "Sis, what if you don't make it? What if you don't make it? What if this is it?" And she was quiet for a minute, and then she said, "I really don't want to think about that." And I said, "I don't want to think about it either, but I think somebody needs to be thinking about it."
Mhm.
And I said, "So let's don't think about it, but let's think about thinking about it." And I asked her, "What does it feel like to think about thinking about it?" And that opened the door to some of the most incredible conversations I've ever had with my sister. And I feel like in the last 3 weeks of her life, I had an opportunity to get to know her in a way I had never known her in the previous 49.
Yeah.
Because suddenly all the fluff of life falls away, all of the things that we busy our minds with, and we were talking about some real vulnerable stuff, and
Yeah.
being like raw and honest and real with each other.
Yeah.
We humans don't slow down enough to do that very often.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I just noticed when you had a very vulnerable moment there too, when you were talking about your sister, and talk a little bit, what what kinds of feelings were brought up for you when you were talking?
There was a moment where I had this moment of clarity where I recognized, as hard as it was for me to be thinking about losing her,
Mhm.
she was having to think about losing everything.
Yes.
everything, hopes, dreams, future, all of it. And it helped me really sort of put a healthy container, I think, around my grief, and be willing to be present in whatever way she needed. um, and I told her a story about a friend of mine who had contacted me and said, Val, I have this friend who's dying with cancer, and I just can't help but think if she would just eat better, maybe she could get through this, but all she wants is apple pie. What should I do? And my response was, bake her an apple pie. To me, it's just that simple. And so I told my sister that, and every day I would start the day with her, like, what kind of apple pie do you want today? And sometimes that was, you know, dust the ceiling fan because she felt so awful she hadn't been able to keep up her house. And as she looked at the dust on the ceiling fan, it was just too depressing for her, you know.
Yeah.
And I think just that moment of clarity that I had, that she was dying and she needed someone to accompany her,
Mhm.
who was willing to be, wow, this is getting really emotional, open to that,
Yeah.
to be willing to take steps with her, even though we were both terrified. Having courage doesn't mean not having fear.
Yeah.
It means taking steps with your fear. That's what courage is.
Yeah.
And that's what we agreed to do with one another. And and that's really what catapulted me into this movement, is the fact that it's okay to break yourself open,
Yeah.
and be willing to accompany someone, um, even if you're terrified.
Yeah. Yeah. Boy, this bringing back a lot of memories. My mom was diagnosed when I was 16 years old,
Wow.
and I was really the last child to be at home, and I mean, it sounds like your sister was very lucky to have you and to be emotionally connected, and so you knew to be present, you knew to be emotionally there. And unfortunately, like my family was very typical of a lot of other families. We were just very emotionally disconnected.
Hmm.
We did not know how to be there. My father was the son. He was, he's the son of an alcoholic dad, and so he was not, and still not today. I mean, I think he's 90 years old, still not able to be emotionally present, and that was unfortunate. Um, so we floundered on our own.
Yeah.
Survived on our own as fast as we could. And so, anyway, I don't know. So it's you know, uh, people do the best that they can,
Yes.
and really, this is the heart of the discussion, right? Is talking about this avoidance that we have, apparent avoidance that we have in this nation
Yes.
surrounding the discussion of death, which is inevitable.
Right. And
Uh,
the what you just said, that people do the best they can, I think it's one of the most beautiful phrases I think one can hear when it comes to dying, because we aren't any of us experts, right? And so I really feel that we have to help one another understand that it's okay not to know what to do. Even it's okay to just show up and try to do the best that you can. And humans, we're messy. Humans are messy. There's no formula that says, okay, if this is happening, then do ABC and everything's going to be okay. Our lives just don't work that way. We're messy about everything, and dying just is another part of that mess. And so I think what it is the if we can find within ourselves to be okay to be a mess, and okay to be afraid, and okay to say, I don't know what to do, so let's not know what to do together.
mm,
Right? Let's be together and not know what to do, rather than be apart and not know what to do. right?
Yeah. Yeah. And what occurred to me, you're exactly right. What occurred to me was, there's there's two things going on. One, we can have a dialogue about this. We need to have a necessary dialogue about this in the nation. But at the same time, dialogues can be very standoffish in the arm's length, and so we can use objective terms and not relate to them. The other side is learning how an experiential quality of learning how to be present when someone is going through suffering. And that's something that I had to personally learn over time.
Hmm.
I was lucky enough to engage and find some things that kind of open that door so I can have that experiential quality to you know really connect with other people so my kids don't have to go through the same thing that I had to go through.
Right, right.
Yeah.
And it's challenging because if you don't, as a human being, we know what we know and we kind of know what we don't know. It's really hard to put our finger on not knowing what we don't know, right? So if you don't have the awareness that, maybe I'm not vulnerable enough, or maybe I'm too afraid to be honest with my feelings.
Yeah.
Like you have to have a way to sort of crack that open. I think, going back to your original question about what goes through a person's mind when the diagnosis is announced, that is that opportunity. That
Mhm.
it's that opportunity to say, oh, this is what it feels like to be terrified.
Yeah.
This is what it feels like, and feel my heart rate increasing, and I feel dizzy, and to be able to identify what is going on and be willing to share that with another human being. In my sister's process, that was the way we were able to connect,
Mhm.
to say, okay, I don't want to talk about it, you don't want to talk about it, so let's just think about talking about it. Let's just crack the door open a little bit at a time until we can get our arms around it, because otherwise you're left with, like, I remember receiving a call from a friend of hers, dear friend of hers, who wanted to come see her, but she said, I know she's really sick and I know she needs her rest. And I told her friend on the phone, it's like, if you don't come see her, you're not going to get to see her. She doesn't need her rest, she needs to see you see her.
Yeah. Yeah. And
um,
sometimes when people say that, it just occurs to me, I'm sorry, when people say, oh no, I can't see, she needs her rest, is more avoidance than uh, legitimately allowing someone to rest.
well, it
You
could
know?
be, or it could be just, I think there's a great deal of naivety around, um it seems considerate. Oh, this person's really sick, I don't want to interfere, I don't want to, I want them to have their rest. But when you hear a diagnosis of stage 4 cancer, that generally means it's not a simple thing like a cold the person's going to get over, right? Thankfully, her friend heard me say what I said and came to see her.
Yeah.
And the look on my sister's face when her friend walked in the room was amazing to witness.
Oh yeah.
It-
Yeah.
because it just, that human connection that she could have one more time before she died. And that's what she just wanted to see her friend one more time.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. It occurred to me when I fell into behavior analysis. Um, Behavior analysis was taught in a very cold, matter of fact way, and I was able to get through graduate school and take the exam. I wasn't taught any of of the therapeutic relationship, this intimacy with another human being can happen. And so it's just strictly the science. And so there's a lot of people out there with you can dissect behavior and analyze behavior, talk about it. And so relating to you, was it natural for you to move in that direction? Did you have those qualities about you early on that you were able to connect and feel and be present?
I didn't. I had to learn those as well. I I was an EMT for a short period of time, and I had studied as a homeopath, and with holistic medicine, and so I had an understanding of how really like the mind body complex goes together. Like it's, there is first the human being and then the disease. And so when I was able to show up for my sister, I was not showing up because she was sick. I was showing up because she was my sister and because of our relationship. So it's a big difference.
Yeah.
And I had just started reading a little bit of Brene Brown about vulnerability, and I grew up also in an alcoholic family where the only emotions that got expressed were the ones that would keep my dad calm. And so, I had that awareness as well, that we, as a family, had not done really well in developing ourselves with any sense of vulnerability. That meant weakness, right?
Yeah.
And so again, that moment of clarity that I had where I thought, okay, it hurts to be losing her, but I can't imagine what it's like to be losing everything. And I just felt like I needed to jump into that deep pool with her. I don't know exactly why, other than I knew she needed somebody who wouldn't tell her you can beat this and avoid talking about it.
Yeah. Yeah. Why? Shifting gears, what makes us, people in a state such as Maine who are willing to pass and have this discussion, willing to pass legislation like this, different from states like Texas or other states that have not even considered legislation?
Well, I think again, Maine has been trying since 1995. So the issue has been in front of people, at least in some form or another, for 25 years.
Yeah.
I think any social change is going to happen when there's pressure for it to happen. So number one, if this is something that the people of Texas want, even if their politicians don't want it, there has to be an organized movement that continues to bring the issue forward, continues to tell the personal stories, and continues to put pressure on politicians to listen. So if it took Maine, we had 7 different attempts here in Maine before we finally passed it in 25 years. I feel also like probably within 1 or 2 more generations, things are going to be shifting. Frankly, a lot of folks who are morally opposed to this, they're going to die too. Politicians are going to die. Those of us who seem to have narrower views of these ideas, there are younger generations coming up that don't share those same views. When I talk with younger people about this issue, particularly if they've witnessed grandma or grandpa die already, it's a no-brainer to them. That's like, of course, this makes perfect sense. So I think there's that component. I think, I don't really know much about the demographics of Texas or the political landscape of Texas, but certainly that plays a role. The identity, state identity of who Texas is, and how your politics kind of revolve around your state personality, I think are going to come into play.
Yeah, as I said, I mean, there really is a strong dissonance in Texas. We are very much about choice, and everything else. Don't interfere. The government is not going to interfere in my business and how I want to choose and how to live, with the exception of abortion
Right.
and death with dignity.
Is That's interesting because if you go back and look at the history of this movement in the United States, it originally was a Republican issue. It was about autonomy. It was about the government staying out of my business.
Right.
It was about maintaining control over your life.
Mhm.
And I'm not sure why that has shifted over the past 25 years. Um, a lot of issues have shifted over the past 25 years in terms of political party focus and so forth. um, here in Maine, when the law passed, we had two Republicans who supported it. Two.
Mhm.
One was a senator who was actually a co-sponsor on the bill. She was amazing. And the other was a representative in the House.
Mhm.
That was it.
So there is a strong um, uh, political separation. I mean, so when we talk about broad support, are we talking about mostly Democrats versus
It tends to split out that way, even though it is a nonpartisan issue. So it's all, I used to wonder if Republicans thought they wouldn't die. Like, I just didn't understand it. I think part of it too is, those more moderate Republicans who do have a view that this is an acceptable uh, practice for patients who want to have that control. I don't know that there's much political safety in being public with that, given the dynamics of the GOP overall.
Yeah.
So there's that, as well as is how difficult is it um, to have a more moderate view on this topic within a party that just doesn't have a moderate view of it.
Yeah. And I was also thinking too, when you're talking about the evangelical right has their stranglehold on the Republican Party. Do you think plays a large part in it, where really the argument comes down for them? This is not what God wants. This is
I think that is a huge part of it. And frankly, I don't know how we overcome that. The recognition, I think, as an interfaith minister, I have an understanding that a human being who has a belief system, no matter what it is, that is something that is sacred to that person. And it's my obligation to help them make meaning of their lives within the context of their own faith tradition. This evangelical movement that says, this is my belief and it needs to be your belief too, or I'm going to ensure that laws go in place so that you can't express your beliefs.
yeah.
I don't think that's a spiritual value. That's something else, clearly, at least in my mind, outside of spiritual values.
Yeah. Mm-mm. Well, maybe it has to do too, this blending, those fairly recent blending from the evangelical movement in politics, and how there is really no separation right now. There is a strong political evangelical wing
Mhm.
in our government that um, you know uh, creates laws and rules that maintain their own power.
Yes. Yeah, and I don't, I grew up hearing about separation of church and state. I don't think it's ever really existed. I
Uh,
really
you
don't.
know, and it's an ideal, but no, not practically anyway.
Yeah, and I mean, sadly, we are a diverse country, and yet
Yeah.
diversity is not something that's valued in, particularly in expressions of faith. And I don't understand that either.
Well, then I don't understand too. Maybe you can explain this. There is, no European country outside of, let's say, Switzerland, Norway, has death with dignity laws, do they? In the
No,
European Union,
no.
and yet they're not. They're more. they're considered a lot more secular than the United States. The United States is considered very Christian, very Christian, strong Christian nation. European Union, for the most part, is secular. I think that laws have been tried to pass in the UK and have been turned down. And can you talk a bit more about that and what the concerns are with that?
Well, I do still believe it is organized religious opposition. I mean, if you look at the stories that are coming out of the countries that are and have been for a number of years trying to pass these laws, it's always the church that is opposing it. And I think the church has as much influence in their politics as it does in our politics.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, and then questions so there are 10 states in the United States, correct? Or 10 jurisdictions
Yeah.
in the United States, correct? One of the jurisdictions being Washington, D.C. And it really all originated with this Oregon law. One of the states is Montana, which really surprised me. What was going on? Do you know the history of Montana?
I do, not deeply, but the ability for medical aid in dying came about in Montana as the result of a lawsuit that was brought by a gentleman who had lung cancer against the state, stating that he felt the Constitution, the state constitution of Montana, protected his right to have a conversation with his physician and qualify, and it protected his physician's right to prescribe medication for him if he was terminally ill. And the ultimate result of that lawsuit was that the state Supreme Court of Montana stated there are no laws currently in statute. There's no current statute that prohibits this. And that's the way it stood. And so it has been essentially protected as a right of a citizen to make that decision for themselves. And the challenge for Montana is every year they face, or pretty much every year, they face a bill coming forward by someone who wants to interfere with that. So just recently, I don't remember the bill number, but just recently a bill was brought forward to try to remove physician protections so that if a physician did support a patient's decision, they would no longer be protected under the law.
Yeah. And see, that was my next question was, I mean, it would seem like next cycle, tons of bills would be proposed to oppose that.
Right. And interestingly enough, this one ended in a tie vote, which meant the bill was not going to move forward to remove the protections. The next step that the legislature took was voting to table the bill indefinitely. And it was overwhelmingly tabled. Mm-hmm. So that tells me that there are lawmakers in the state of Montana who support this process for patients and don't want to see it overturned mm-hmm. by the number of people who voted to table it indefinitely. They didn't necessarily vote, against the bill itself, but they voted to table it.
Right.
I found that pretty fascinating.
Yeah, well, which tells me too, this is important to the values of the people in Montana.
Right.
This is an important issue, and the important values across Republicans. When we're talking about approximately 72% of the American people support such legislation, there's not 72% Democrats.
Right.
A lot of those are Republican values as well. And do you find that that's kind of many legislators while they're Republican or Democrat, they have their own value. They know what the values are in their district, but then they vote according to their party. And if the party is opposed, they're opposed.
Yes, or they vote according to their personal values and ignore the values of their constituency. I mean, interestingly enough, the previous two sessions I was involved here in Maine, we had a Republican senator who sponsored the bill. And he was very much on board with this issue and very much recognized a person's need for autonomy in decision-making around end of life. And boy, did he get barbecued for that. I mean, he was
Sure.
for having that stance. And interestingly enough, too, I mean, we had Republican lawmakers who would not publicly support the bill, but who privately did.
Mm.
And for whatever reason, whether it was they worried about losing their seat or votes, or I don't know what their concerns were, um,
Yeah.
but they couldn't publicly support the bill.
Yeah. Well, and it usually comes down to power, money, and those who donate, right? The very few donors that can donate a lot of money may have very conservative interests. So
Yeah.
I want to be respectful of your time, but I do want to talk about kind of the where the movement is going from here. What states now are popping up that are just really on the cusp and about to pass legislation, and where you see the movement in your job 5 or 10 years out down the road.
Sure. So as we speak, there will be a hearing today in the state of New Mexico with the Senate Judiciary Committee on their bill. I don't know if you have been following New Mexico at all. They have been trying for a long time to pass legislation. And I'm cautiously optimistic. You never really know how these things are going to turn out, but I would say it's likely that New Mexico will be the next state, if not this year, then in their next session. New York and Massachusetts, of course, are working on legislation. Arizona, Nevada, and a number of states across the country. But those states I just mentioned have really been consistently working towards passage for a number of years.
Which surprised me, because I thought that Massachusetts and New York would already have that legislation, and New York, I know, has been kind of bouncing back. The last round failed.
Right.
So, but anyway,
yeah, and Massachusetts too. Last year, or I guess last session, their bill finally came out of a committee with a positive vote. So that's usually like the first step, is once you get a public hearing and you can get a committee to pass a bill favorably, that sort of is what helps the momentum going forward. Until then, there's a representative down in the state of Kansas who he submits a bill because he has constituents who want it. And he knows he can't even get a hearing on it, but he's going to do his due diligence and keep his commitments to his constituents. And submit the bill. Mm-hmm. So, political climate, I think, has everything to do with whether a bill can gain traction.
Okay, all right. And so, picturing 10 years down the road.
10 years down the road, wow. I would like to be able to say, I think I tend to be optimistic. I would like to be able to say that this could be an option available to any state 10 years down the road. Wow. I'm not, I think that's overly optimistic. We live in a country where we can't even agree that we should have equitable access to voting, let alone, access to making our own end of life choices. So we have a lot to overcome.
Yeah.
On many fronts in our society in order to be able to move forward equitably. But I do think, in 1 to 2 generations, I think the landscape's going to look very different on this. And I think too, one of the things we don't really even know the outcome of is in the past 12 months, over 500,000 people have died in this country. Death is not a stranger to us anymore. And death is a very public thing right now, tragically so.
Yeah.
If you do the math on that, that is one person every 60 seconds for the past year who've died a COVID death. Mm-hmm. And you hear the stories of how I actually watched a family gather around an iPad to be with their loved one as their loved one was being intubated because they couldn't go in the room. So we are a country literally, I think, brought to our knees right now with grief and loss,
Yeah.
and we have to be willing to face what that means, and find our way forward in a more compassionate, meaningful way for patients and families. We
Yeah.
have to.
Thank you for bringing that up, because I mean, I really think that COVID is a game changer in that. You know, everything I see is a double-edged sword. COVID has been devastating and has brought a lot of death, but not only like death and disability, cost, so forth. The positive side of it is that was forcing us, is creating this dialogue and broadening our perspective. People die, and not only die, but they suffer,
Yes.
and we can do something about it. We
Right.
have the ability now, medicine has evolved now to where we can alleviate that suffering and bring families together and make it just seems so beautiful to me when Brittany Menard, and I'll probably kind of put this um, clip in. Brittany Menard's talked about how she wanted to die.
Yes.
She's describing, you know what, very matter of factly, she was going to explore the world until and live for experiences. She was going to play music. She would have, and she had like I think 9 people that she had invited, and it just it turned out exactly the way she wanted.
Right.
And what's more beautiful and intimate than that? What
I
that
agree. And why
the
why
human
why is that a
experience?
bad thing? I
It's
mean,
not- yeah,
I feel like this is my personal feeling. When a human being transitions out of their body, we should be able to have some sort of celebration around that, the same way we do when someone is born.
yeah,
It's a big event. and
yes,
and for that person leaving, for my sister, the morning of the day she died, she said she wanted to taste coffee again, one more time.
simple
And
things.
so I got a teaspoon of coffee for her, and honest to God, here, the look that crossed her face when that coffee rested on her tongue was heaven. And to me, it was amazing, that, like, how beautiful to be able to leave this world. Raspberries was the other taste she wanted, to leave the world with the taste of coffee and raspberries on your lips,
Yeah,
in the
yeah,
arms of the people who love you.
yeah.
I don't think any of us could hope for something bigger than that.
No, no. I mean, you know what? It just that's what really like life funnels down to the taste of coffee on your tongue and being around people that you love, not doing all these big, massive things that you have to do something that matters to matter in the world. It's we just have this we have this um it, it, this ability now to turn the kind of meaning in this country of
Yes.
what life is all about, what humanity is all about, what life, what our purpose is. And it's not about money, and
Right.
it's not about satisfying job requirements. It's not about looking good. It's about living and connecting, about
Yes.
compassion, is about knowing that when you're on your deathbed, that you can have the people around you that care about you.
Yes. Yeah, I
Make
couldn't
it
agree
happen.
more. It's like, who are we without our stories and without the people that we love? I mean, that is what creates meaning in our lives, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Um, Last question, I promise. What is the so if I wanted to get involved in the state of Texas where there's no dialogue, there's no legislation, and I wanted to help organize, what would what would I have to do? What are the resources out there?
With National, our organization, we support grassroots movements in states to be able to help you learn the issue, how to organize. We can help with a little bit of infrastructure or seed money to, often you need a website or something like that to try to get going. And then, to just look at resources that deal with grassroots organizing. The way I did it in Maine is I started with a handful of people who were interested, and ultimately those people know people and they know people, and ultimately we passed a law. So have an interest, bring your voice to that interest. Don't let your lawmakers off the hook, and know that it's not going to happen in a weekend. It is a long-term issue, and you've got to be in it for the long haul.
Yeah, right. But you know what? If history tells us anything, that culture can be quick to change.
Absolutely.
You know how quickly the culture in Texas is in fact changing as we speak. I just would encourage anybody who feels passionate about this movement to get involved. And where can they donate? What
they can donate to Death with Dignity National Center. Visit our site, deathwithdignity.org. There's a menu item that says in your state. You can click on that, click on the state of Texas, write your lawmakers from that website. Certainly contact us if you're interested in grassroots organizing. And we would be happy to be able to support the folks in Texas to ultimately win this for their state as well.
Yes, yeah, we would too. Thank you so much, Val. It was a pleasure. It really, really was a pleasure.
Thank you, Hugh, for having me. And I feel like I have made a new connection to at a vulnerable level, and I really appreciate the fact that you asked me to be here today.
Yeah, it was an honor. Yeah, thank you so much.
Spit on the ground, hold your breath, try to scare yourself to death. Bury your bones under the dirt and tear at your heart and rip your shirt and stomp your feet in disgust. Curse the gray skies if you must, but you'll find when you are done, blue skies for everyone. Break your heart and give up the race before you start. Drop your drawers and roll around. Burn your house right to the ground. Go to sleep, hit your head, screaming till your face is red. But you'll find when you are done, blue skies for everyone. Blue skies, setting sun, cherry pie.